Hey, good morning, folks, and welcome to today's webinar on 3 ways to prevent application zero-day attacks. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping items. You will notice we are using the Webinar Jam viewer today, and you all have joined us in listen-only mode. That means you're muted to cut back on the background noise, but that does not mean we don't want to hear from you. So feel free to chat with us or drop any questions via the chat window, and we will make sure to address them right away. The webinar recording will be sent to all the webinar participants post the webinar. So about the speakers. So I have here Venkatesh Sundar, or Venki as he's like to be called. He is the founder and currently the CMO at Indusface. He's responsible for international growth, though a marketer and business dev role now. Prior to this, he was the core engineer, CTO, who built the entire Indusface technology stack ground up. So basically, a hardcore technologist turned marketer now. We also have Scott Wright, who is a veteran Ottawa-based security consultant who provides tailored security assessment and training solutions for business teams. He has almost 20 years of experience in the information security field, working with both public and private sector organizations. Scott is the creator of the new Streetwise Training Academy for online education of staff, which basically talks about cybersecurity risk. In today's webinar, Scott will discuss what are zero-day vulnerabilities and why they are dangerous. And Venki will take us through the application zero-day attacks that have taken place in the past 6 months and 3 ways to defend against them. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Scott. Scott, you can go ahead and get started with the presentation today.
Thanks very much, Nikhil. And thank you everyone for joining us today from wherever you are. For those of you who haven't heard of zero-day attacks or who have heard of them but aren't sure what they are, here's a quick description of those types of vulnerabilities and attacks. So I guess if we are looking at, just trying to get myself oriented here on my screens. A zero-day attack is really very much like other types of malicious attacks in that they exploit a vulnerability in an application. And a vulnerability is simply a situation that might exist where there are some unintended consequences and unintended ways for somebody to gain access to software functions or data on a system without proper authorization, obviously. It may be something like software that doesn't check input data to see if it's valid, or it might allow an attacker to manipulate or see parts of the system that it shouldn't. So we're talking about web and mobile applications that run in business network environments, as well as those offered by web-based vendors. Examples of vulnerabilities include things like Heartbleed, which I think Venki may talk about later on, which was a vulnerability in web servers from a few years ago that could have exposed sensitive encryption key information during web sessions. Or it could simply be an application feature that allows too much flexibility to users and wasn't really thought out or tested well enough by the vendors, to the point where an attacker may be able to upload and run their own software code, which would obviously cause potential damage and injury to the organization and possibly its customers. However, the term zero-day actually refers to a kind of vulnerability that is unknown to the vendor and provides or the vendor that provides or deploys the application. Zero-day really means that the vendor has 0 days to fix the vulnerability before an attacker may try to actually exploit it. In other words, the attack is more likely to be an attack that targets a vulnerability that's already known to the vendor or to the public. So how does an attacker know about a vulnerability and exploit it before the vendor himself is able to identify it and fix it? Well, there are a couple of ways. Number one is that To find a zero-day vulnerability is not easy. Attackers might have to spend a lot of time, and their capabilities have to be pretty good to be able to do the research, to run complex tests on the applications and see if there are any parts of them that might not handle unexpected error conditions properly. Now, this can allow for specially crafted inputs to cause an application to crash, and it might then allow unauthorized access to more privileged data on the programs or on the computer. The other way an attacker might obtain knowledge of a zero-day vulnerability is just from associating with other friends online through secret online forums, maybe in the dark net,
Scott,
or yes.
Scott, yeah, sorry about that, Venki here. Is this supposed to go to the next slide?
Not yet. No, I'm just talking about the vulnerability. Sorry, consequences. No problem. So yeah, basically any attacker who wants to attack a particular organization may be associating with other attackers, sharing information about 0 days, or they may actually purchase them online on black market sites, for example. So either way, the 0 day vulnerabilities are valuable to an attacker, as they are pretty high return on investment when they're able to get them to work. So my third bullet on this slide actually is talking about the types of things that are actually happening right now. According to Symantec's Internet Threat Report of 2016, the number of targeted attacks on businesses has increased by 125%, which is almost an exponential type of increase. It means that attackers are getting really good at researching their targets. They're seeing the opportunity for financial gain from this activity. And when they do their initial research, they're looking to learn about anything that could be useful in making their attack successful. They'll want to find a target organization that has information or systems that are of value to them. And the organization may actually be just a stepping stone to some larger target. So to get at them, attackers need to understand the vulnerabilities that are in that particular business's network. Typically, they're looking for information about both human vulnerabilities and technical vulnerabilities in the business's network environment. So the human vulnerabilities are a good starting point where an attacker may look for a path to the internal systems. It might include targeting system users who aren't trained to handle things like phishing emails or social engineering attacks, which could be disguised as some anonymous or harmless inquiry. So allowing the attacker to try to learn about the kinds of controls and infrastructure configurations used by the business. But once they have a way to observe the network environment, it gives them more information about what kinds of application technologies they would want to focus on to do more research and find those zero-day attacks or zero-day vulnerabilities. So in a major, I think in some other statistics we have, it shows that on average, a new 0 day is found every week pretty much. And so there's really no shortage of opportunities for attackers to try to use the 0 day attacks. And the more complex applications running in a network, the more potential vulnerabilities there are for an attacker to utilize. But the important thing to realize, just to summarize this slide, is that businesses, by definition, there's no patch for the vendor or that the vendor has provided that can address the risks from a 0 day vulnerability and attack. And this kind of vulnerability exposes the entire system in terms of the possibility of network exploitation and therefore major data breaches. So we expect the vendor to work pretty hard to create security patches that'll fix the problems. But the vendor really first has to learn about the vulnerability, and we don't really know how they're going to find out about it, because the window of opportunity is usually pretty small, but the attackers are going to try and leverage it as much as they can. So moving to the next slide, as you can see, we've got a timeline. So let's assume that a cyber criminal has a target business in mind and knows that the business's network is using a particular type of software, or maybe it offers a service via a web application to its customers. Then the cyber criminal can either do research or acquire details about some 0 day vulnerability that may be applicable to that environment. but then they have to either create or buy the exploit that would be useful to exploit that vulnerability. And they may use a package of malicious software, malware, etc., that could leverage that secretly known vulnerability only a few people know about. So once the exploit is triggered, the cybercriminal gains access to the systems or the data within the target's network, but only after the vendor learns of that exploit, as I said before, or the vulnerability, can it create a software patch to fix it. So vendors sometimes learn the hard way or the embarrassing way about zero-day vulnerabilities. They might experience a major breach. They might not have realized that it existed until it's reported by customers that their accounts are either breached or they've lost some valuable information or data. Or sometimes law enforcement investigators or even media reporters will contact vendors to say, you know what, we found evidence that you've been hacked. And then the vendors look a little closer and they say, oh yeah, gee, sorry, I guess we made a mistake here. So cybercriminals might be able to use a vulnerability on more than one victim organization before it's discovered. It depends on how widely used the software is. And it may target either server-based systems or even mobile devices. We can see that the number of zero-day vulnerabilities has really grown pretty much exponentially over the last few years. And one reason for that rapid increase in 0 days is because of the growth in web-based applications that are developed by, I'll say, less mature organizations. If we step back for a minute and look at major desktop application developers like Microsoft, Adobe, and the browser vendors, we know that many of them have been around for a long time and they've learned a lot of lessons, shall we say. So, but they're complex software. Their software is complex, and it tends to have vulnerabilities that appear at more or less a constant rate. Once in a while, we hear about a big one, but they're pretty good at doing the upfront research to find any vulnerabilities before an attacker does. They're also careful not to announce to the world that they've found a vulnerability in their software until they actually have a security patch for it and it's available. So that kind of reduces the opportunity for 0 days when an attacker might be able to launch an attack before there is actually any defense for it. But web-based and mobile applications that have been growing quickly are less mature in many cases, and the vendors that provide them may not have a mature vulnerability research program that's able to find and fix those bugs before they're found by the attackers. So this means that there are significant risks to running and using any kind of application software without additional safeguards. And those are the safeguards I think Venki is going to be talking about shortly. And so just going to the next slide, before we start talking about the defenses, just want to recap and do a little bit of discussion on the terminology. As we talked about zero-day attacks, they really exploit the vulnerabilities, the zero-day vulnerabilities that are not currently patched from a vendor and about which the vendor may not even know. So even if your systems are completely up to date with the latest patches from the vendors, they can still have zero-day vulnerabilities, making them susceptible to zero-day attacks. To realize is that because attackers clearly don't want to tell anyone about the vulnerabilities they may have, nobody really knows if there are any serious 0 days or associated attacks that are about to be used or even already in use without the vendor's knowledge. And if the vendor doesn't know about it, any customers that rely on the software clearly don't know about these vulnerabilities either. So there's quite a bit of risk at this point, and a lot of it is unknown. Now, when we get to the point of describing additional safeguards that can be used to detect and stop zero-day attacks, there are a few terms that are also important to understand. A true positive is a term we use to describe a situation when you identify an attack or a malicious code activity correctly. And that's what we're aiming for. It's like when you have a smoke alarm in your house, and if there's a fire, the smoke alarm goes off. That's what we want. It's a true positive alarm. But in any kind of detection system, we have a risk of being incorrect. And so if we're incorrect in identifying a threat as being real when it isn't, it's called a false positive. It's like a false alarm on your fire alarm. So if maybe you burn your toast and the smoke alarm goes off, that's a false positive, really, from the point of view of the purpose of the alarm. But we can also be incorrect by failing to identify a real threat when it's acting or imminent. We call that a false negative. So something slipped through the defenses that shouldn't have. And in the case of a smoke alarm, if a fire occurs and the smoke alarm doesn't go off, there can be really disastrous consequences. Whereas a false positive, flagging an alarm when it's not real can be an inconvenience, and it can actually hit productivity too. So we don't want false positives or false negatives for sure. Looking at the kinds of defenses that we do have and traditionally have been used, it's typically a variation of the defenses against malware, like antivirus programs and other programs that are capturing information and telling us that we have some kind of attack going on. So the solutions either typically look at things like statistics related to known types of software that can be risky. So typically they might block the software if it's likely to have malware in it that could hurt the application area or the systems. Or it could be signature-based analysis to look at the code or the data that is about to be run or to be opened. And there are often patterns in that data or software that can be detected, allowing it to be blocked before it's actually activated. And finally, there's a behavior-based detection technique where it looks at the activities that might provide clues to the existence of malware. It may be that an application wants to connect to certain IP addresses very often, or it makes unusual sets of communications between different systems. These can be the types of clues that would be behavior-based attack. And each of these techniques or mechanisms obviously has their advantages and disadvantages depending on what types of threats are hitting. So it's likely that a combination of these techniques will be needed to provide the best detection coverage. So getting to that combination of techniques that is right and optimal for your organization is really important. And so at this point, I'm actually going to turn the presentation over to Venki Sundar at Indusface to dig a little deeper into the practical solutions to the problems of detecting and blocking zero-day attacks. Venki?
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. That was pretty insightful and very nicely putting the groundwork, the framework and the basics on what is a zero-day attack and why it is risky. So what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes is to take off from where Scott left and start off with a couple of examples. I'm pretty sure in the last 3 or 4 years, I think Heartbleed and Poodle are probably the two biggest zero-day attacks that I can think of. In 2016, I have still not seen something as big as Heartbleed and Poodle. Fingers crossed. Thankfully, I don't expect to see. They did cause a lot of pain. Heartbleed was very interesting in terms of the zero-day attack. It was a problem with an OpenSSL version, and the attack payload looked perfectly legitimate. There was nothing that we can do signature-based to identify that this is an attack payload. When you're running a specific version of an OpenSSL software, and most of the people, any SSL Apache or any web server, or any kind of SSL handshake, what the payload will be perfectly legitimate, exploiting a vulnerability in a specific version of OpenSSL to give a 64 kilobyte memory dump to the user. And because it's a memory dump, it can have sensitive information like passwords. So imagine going to a banking site and continuously doing this in brute force, taking 64 kilobytes of memory chunk data, and then scanning it to see if I can find something interesting, username, passwords, private keys, and so on and so forth. It was a nightmare because most of the BFSIs, they didn't know how long the attack is happening. They did not even know if it's happening right now. So the only way to do this is, of course, you have to patch your version of OpenSSL to make sure it is not having 1.0.1 and 1.0.2. Make sure the right protocols and the patching is in place. But even after that, people can still force a handshake or a downgrade of the protocol and try to exploit it. So the only defense against this can be statistical profiling and behavioral profiling to see what are all the things they are doing which might look like a Heartbleed. But the best defense was, of course, first patching your system and then making sure that you're tracking the hacker. So this was one of the biggest zero-day attack, I think, in the last 3 to 4 years. The other one, in terms of business impact, was a lot bigger than Heartbleed. Like Poodle allows an attacker to take complete control of your shell or your bone shell, which most of the people were running. But the defense against that was not as much of a nightmare. Of course, you can patch it, but for somebody to get access to your shell through an application layer, typically what they will try to do is, after getting access, they will be trying to execute some commands. So any kind of remote command injection in the protocol through a signature-based attack, most of them can be blocked. So Poodle was a big impact in terms of, if Poodle exploit happens, somebody takes complete control of a system. But the defense against that was pretty much easy through a signature-based policy. So I think those are two examples I wanted to give, which anybody in the space would have that still fresh in their mind. These two, the Heartbleed and the Poodle. What I want to do in the next slide is I want to talk a little bit about, we have our own signature development labs and our vulnerability research team. My company, basically what we do is we are a total application security software vendor. We scan, as currently we have 3,000 plus applications that we scan, find vulnerabilities, and provide protection against them at real time. And as part of that, we also collect data of zero-day vulnerabilities against all applications, right? And on a monthly basis, actually on a weekly basis, the statistics I have collected on the slide is showing it on a monthly basis. But on a weekly basis, we send out a report to all our customers and all of our subscribers saying that these are all the zero-day attacks that has happened for this week. And then we tell them what should be done for them to provide a defense against them. So the statistics here is basically a raw count, month-on-month count of the zero-day application level vulnerabilities that we have seen for the last 6 months. July is a good month for us because it's just 16 so far. Hopefully it doesn't go up. It's still 5-6 days left. But roughly we have been getting more than one application level zero-day vulnerability a day. This includes everything. It can be a vulnerability in your WordPress plugin or your Joomla or content management system or a help desk system. Any application level zero-day vulnerability which can be exploited unless the vendor patches it is what we track, and we start sending out recommendations to our customers on what they should do about it. Now, here's the interesting thing. Most of the literature on zero-day vulnerability, and Scott also touched on it, where a proper defense requires statistical-based, signature-based, as well as behavioral-based. And most of the literature that I've been seeing talks about signature-based or negative security model does not cut it, which to an extent is true. But signature still is a very good starting point defense. From this data, what I'm showing here is 90% of the vulnerability that we have found in the last 6 to 7 months, the first attack could have been prevented through a very simple signature. And I will start explaining that a little bit more later on. And the reason for that is there is a vulnerability, and the attacker tries to exploit that vulnerability. And most of the exploit, going back to the example they gave of Poodle, was a command injection, right? Poodle, the exploit is basically trying to execute command on the system after gaining control of the system. So remote command injection at an application layer, if you start seeing commands that should not, RM minus RF, as an example, I can have a very simple signature that no application in its proper design and proper frame of mind will have a payload that accepts RM minus RF as a valid string in a command in a HTTP header, right? Or a SQL injection attack. You can have a lot of these common attacks, which is what an attacker will do after finding the vulnerability, and have patterns to block them. So that even if the vulnerability or the zero-day vulnerability is not patched, you can still block them through a very simple signature-based policies. And those that cannot be blocked, you can quickly develop a custom rule for blocking them. And some of them, the vectors are not known. Like Heartbleed is an example where there is no known vector based on which I can identify that this is a Heartbleed, right? It's exploiting a vulnerability in OpenSSL. So in those situations is where you have to use a little bit more intelligence or statistical profiling, behavioral profiling to find out, is it an attacker-like behavior? But signature-based policies can be a good starting point because it has the biggest bang for the buck, and it's very easy to do as well. And then in the next slide, I'm going to further dissect it based on the type of attacks. So you can see the example I gave was an attacker finds a zero-day vulnerability. It can be a SQL injection that I can do on a private field on a WordPress plugin, right? So it's a SQL injection vulnerability on a new WordPress module, but the attack is going to be SQL injection. And you can certainly prevent SQL injection type attacks. Very simple things which people do through automated scanner, single quote or 1 equal to 1, right? All those low-level attackers who can still do the exploits will at least be blocked through the simple signatures. Cross-site scripting and SQL injection accounted for the most amount of vulnerabilities that were part of the zero-day attacks that was being carried out. Command injection was next. So I think most of this can be blocked through a combination of signatures and custom rule sets. If the payload is not available, you can block them through behavioral and statistical profiling. So I want to back this up with some example in the last 6 months at an application level. So Apache in this last 6 months, fortunately we did not have something as big as Heartbleed, but Apache Struts, it's a framework. Struts is a framework which had a major vulnerability. Any applications that are built on the Struts framework would be vulnerable. So they had to fix it and use a new Struts framework, recompile the application and deploy it again, which is not going to happen quickly. And the vulnerability was exploiting by doing a command injection on an HTTP content header. Right. So this type of vulnerability can be easily patched through a command injection rule set, saying and it typically gets patched through what we call as our core rule sets. Core rule sets are what we call a standard set of signature-based rules and pattern matching based on which most of the vulnerabilities can be blocked. The couple of other examples I have is a SQL injection vulnerability on a WordPress. There are many of them that came up in the last 5-6 months. Cross-site request forgery vulnerability in a very popular help desk system. This required a custom rule because it's taking over the session when somebody is logged in. So that can be blocked through a custom rule. So what we do is we send a report to our customers which says that these are all the vulnerabilities that exist for this week. These can be blocked through signatures, common core rule sets. This requires custom policies, and some of them cannot be blocked because the payload is not known, but you can block them through some behavioral profiling. But there is no replacement to actually going ahead and actually patching those systems as well. It's not a replacement. It's quickly reacting to this and being able to put a defense layer very quickly. So how do we do this? Like I talk about behaviorals and signatures and all those things. So if you look at the application ecosystem, right, you have a web server, you have multiple applications, web services, these are interacting with each other. And patching them can be a time-consuming process. So there are 3 recommendations that we do, and all 3 recommendations does have a requirement that you have a centralized place through which you can control and put your defense. And that centralized place for an application layer zero-day attack defense is basically an application firewall. So number 1, the myth I'm breaking down here is signatures do have a very strong role to play. That is what my data is saying. Even though people talk a lot about machine learning, behavioral profiling, and so on and so forth, signature by itself is a good starting point. And the data and the amount of blocks the signature-based policy can do can become the input based on which more advanced profiling as label data, statistic based on which more advanced defense can be built. So number 1, develop a quick policy in your centralized application layer entry point to have signatures, bad signatures that can be blocked quickly. And if we have good signatures, it's a positive security model. A positive security model that knows for a fact it's not an attack, you can allow them. So signatures have a very strong role to play to put a very strong defense system at an application layer. The second recommendation, which absolutely you must have an application firewall, right? Web application firewall to counter your zero-day defense very well. Because what it does is it allows you to quickly patch. I mean, the Heartbleed example that we gave, my customers who were behind our web application firewall, while they went ahead and patched all the applications behind the firewall, all they had to do is the web application firewall itself was patched and not have the Heartbleed vulnerability. So that ensured at least there was a defense, centralized area of defense, which can scale up and down and ensure that you can take a little bit of breathing time to go ahead and patch your applications behind it. So having a centralized application layer entry point where you can quickly roll out the signatures is very, very important. Those things that cannot be fixed through common signatures, because you have a centralized entry point on layer 7, you can still fix them through custom rules. And those custom rules has to be surgically accurate, targeted set of, again, specialized signatures to block a specific payload. The example I gave before was cross-site request forgery kind of attacks. You cannot have a generic signature to block them. It is specific to the application. You need to know what the payloads and specific to the applications are and create a custom signatures. And once you have a firewall and signatures, then based on this, because you have signatures of known and good and bad attacks, you can build your own reputation data of the identities from where bad attacks have happened in the past, and then use that as the basis based on which statistical rules and behavioral based profiling can happen, right? So zero-day defense requires a three-pronged approach, starting with signatures, having a centralized firewall, and then building on top of that with statistical based profiling and behavioral profiling to properly build a proper defense. I think that's probably the three recommendations that I would say is a must for reducing your zero-day attacks impact.
Thank you, Venki and Scott. I'm sure your insights were enriching for our audience today. I would also like to thank the audience for all your questions. If we missed answering any of your questions, we will make sure to reach out to you all post this webinar with your inquiries. I also encourage the audience to visit the Indusface blog page. It has broad knowledge base of topics related to application security, and you can reach the website by following the URL. That's indusface.com/blog. We have also set up a quick poll which would throw up now. I would encourage you all to give us your valuable feedback on this webinar. The poll will last for 10 seconds starting now. We do encourage you all to take a 14-day trial of our TAS solution. For this, you can reach out to us at marketing@indusface.com, or you can visit our website at www.indusface.com. Thank you again, Scott and Venki, for your valuable insights, and the audience for taking your precious time to be part of this webinar. See you all, take care, and have a great day ahead. Thank you.